Hello, I'm Mary Lou Willits from the Middletown Springs Historical Society. Today we're talking with Society President David Wright about the rich agricultural history of Middletown Springs. David, tell us about how agriculture began in Middletown's earliest days.
Well, the early settlers were subsistence farmers. They had to be almost totally self-sufficient. Middletown Springs has been a farming community since the very beginning, when the settlers built log cabins, then frame houses, and established their farms on land that they had purchased sometimes before they even arrived in Middletown. There are farms today that still trace their origin back to the 1700s. However, the land in Middletown was probably not the best in the state, so the Champlain Valley turned out to be a better place for farming. Whereas the first settlers were subsistence farmers, some of them had purchased enough land and were able to develop their farms to a point where they could sell their produce and dairy products outside of the town. They prospered and increased the prosperity of the town. In 1811, there was a major flood here that wiped out all the mills but one or two mills that had been built earlier for cutting lumber and processing grain. In the decades after the flood, the sheep craze came to Vermont. The development of the wool industry with associated woolen mills and textile production touched on Vermont. There was a fulling mill built on the Poultney River, which later was incorporated into A.W. Gray's horsepower factory. Fulling has to do with cleaning raw wool in the spinning of the yarn and the weaving of the cloth.
David, when did dairy come into the picture as a big product?
Well, by the mid-1890s, thanks to the railroads, the product was distributed to a much wider market. In Middletown Springs, like in other Vermont towns, the cream of the milk was used to make butter and cheese in the late 19th century. And it was partly because butter and cheese would keep during transport to the markets, which would be the urban centers, whether just to Rutland or even to out of the state to the New York or Boston markets. So Middletown had at one point 2 or maybe even 3 cheese factories, including maybe small ones on a farm, like the Kenny farm at the end of Spruce Knob Road. Out in the wing, there was supposedly a cheese factory, but mainly for family use, I assume. I don't think they may have, this was in the mid-19th century, they would have perhaps made cheese and taken it into the store and bartered it for something else like cloth or some kind of manufactured goods. But in the late 19th century, there began to be a commercial market for this, and so a cheese factory was built down in the field to the north of the Mineral Springs Park and behind the houses along East Street. There was a big cheese factory down there where the farmers would take their milk. Prior to that, I believe they took the raw milk by wagon to perhaps to Poultney, because we have old photographs showing a whole line of wagons, horse-drawn wagons with big cylindrical containers on the back, and it says something about to the cheese factory or something like that. The Justamere farm under J.E. Buxton started with about 300 acres, but later he acquired, and along with his son Ben Buxton, an additional acreage, bringing the total to over 1,500 acres. A pond was built up on Coy Hill Road above the farm that supplied water power down to the Justamere farm machinery and to the cheese factory and so forth. They had a substantial maple operation, and they also owned 2 or 3 apple orchard sites around town, one of them being later the Buxton Orchard, which later became the Burnham Hollow Orchard. Later on, as insulated cars, freight cars, perhaps even refrigeration that was built into the cars developed, fluid milk could be transported. In Middletown Springs, we had a cooperative creamery on South Street, right by the bridge over the Poultney River. There was a concrete block building there that was built the late 30s, and farmers from not only Middletown Springs but some of the surrounding towns brought their milk there in large metal cans. Cooperative creamery, they had a cooling system that I understand was based on an ammonia kind of a cooling system. It was cooled off there and combined with the other milk, and then shipped out as fluid milk in tractor trailer tankers. Now there was in town also a Borden's plant over on East Street at one point, a Borden dairy plant. And again, I think it was just a collection and minor processing. And as farming moved west, bigger farms produced huge quantities of milk compared to what was being produced in Vermont, and could produce milk more cheaply through scale. And that has even been a trend in Vermont. We now have some very large dairy farms that produce milk. And the whole milk market has been consolidated. I think the Tarbells are the only ones that sell fluid milk. So there are very few in the area. It's impossible to produce the milk and still make a living.
When did apples and potatoes become a commodity here in Middletown Springs?
Well, they became major crops about the time of the end of World War I. Production of apples beyond what was for local consumption had to be apples that would keep for a long time in order to get them out of the town to a place like the Mott Company that made applesauce, let's say, or to some other company that made products from raw apples. They were encouraged to grow apples that kept well, could stand being dumped from one container to another without excessive bruising of the fruit. So in Middletown Springs in the 20s, 30s, they were growing apples like the Northern Spy, which is a very hard, tough apple. Keeps really well without serious refrigeration. But meanwhile, the agricultural schools were developing apples, hybrid kinds of apples that were for specific uses, and the Northern Spy has gone out of favor because the skin is tough and it's not a good eating apple, not considered good eating apple anymore, because you can keep your apples under refrigeration and they'll last a long time, whereas in the old days you kept them in a barrel in the basement, in the unheated basement of your house, and because the Northern Spy has a thick, tough skin, the apple would survive through the winter. The Burnham Hollow Orchard on West Street was going up into the 90s, I believe, and the Quarry family was able to keep it going for quite a while, and I'm not sure exactly, whether it was the economics of selling the apples that made it no longer make sense to do all the work that's involved. There were farmers that grew potatoes. The Spalding farms, of which there were several on Spruce Knob Road, were originally subsistence farms, but later became a dairy operation that was run by Paul Fenton and his son Page Fenton in the mid-1900s. Paul Fenton also grew potatoes on a part of his farm, and one year produced over 22,000 pounds of potatoes in one season. I would say probably the 20s, 30s, or even their teens, potatoes were locally grown, and the building across the street, it's now the town garage, was from during the period from the 1950s, say, to the 1970s, was a storage facility for Ed Farrell's potato growing business. There were many family farms in Middletown, and in fact in 1919 a map was drawn showing the farms in Middletown Springs, and they clearly amount to over 50 names on the map from all the back roads of Middletown.